Yeah, Andy grew up a wrestling fan in Long Island, New York, and he's told me the story when he and I were just sitting around. Andy would come down to Memphis and stay at my house, and I filmed interviews with him with a little camcorder, and we talked about his whole background for I don't know how long, but he told me the whole story of how, wrestling really affected Andy's whole life and his whole career, because as a kid, he loved wrestling and he was a fan of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. That's who he thought hung the moon. And he said, I used to watch him. I was so enthralled watching Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. And he said, as I would watch him, even as a kid, he said, I realized that he was intentionally trying to make me mad or trying to make me hate him. He said, but I still liked him. And he said, that's really what I wanted to do later on in my career. He said, I'm not a comedian. I've never told a joke in my life. I hate when people call me a comedian. He said, I do performance art. He said, I go and do shows. And he said, the thing I like to do most is make my audience mad, like a heel, or make them uncomfortable. And if you look back on it, that's what Andy always did. You never really knew what Andy was really doing, because it's like you said, he made you feel uncomfortable watching whatever show he was doing.
He seemed like he was angry all the time.
Yeah. So anyway, one night, once he got to be famous, he wanted to kind of live out his childhood fantasy of being a wrestler, and he knew he wasn't physically able to do that with a man, so he started wrestling women. And he started doing it in nightclubs and where he was doing stand-up comedy shows, and did it on Merv Griffin, he did it on Saturday Night Live. But he told me, he said, it really wasn't being received the way I wanted to be, because it was never in front of wrestling fans. It was always people that had come there to see something funny or something different, and they just didn't get the wrestling thing. And so he said, I always just wanted to wrestle in front of a wrestling crowd. So I went to, I think it was a show in Long Island, and Vince McMahon Sr. was there, and Andy approached him and told him what he'd like to do, that he would like to wrestle women out of the audience at a wrestling show where all the wrestling fans would get what he was trying to do, and he could be a legitimate heel. And he told me that Vince Sr. said, well, Andy, I'll tell you what, he said, I kind of like the idea, but he said, our fans are so skeptical now. He said, I'm really hesitant to involve a Hollywood actor with our shows, because I think our fans would then start thinking we're all just actors. And so he kind of blew Andy off, and he didn't, he didn't go for the idea. And fortunately for me, Bill Apter was there, and he was a friend of Andy's and overheard that conversation. And he called Andy off to the side, and he said, hey, he said, I got a friend of mine down in Memphis, Jerry Lawler, and they have their own territory down there. And he said, I'll bet if you called him, they would bring you down for the idea. And so then after that, it was almost like the Elvis thing. I got a call from Bill Apter, and he said, hey, you ever heard of Andy Kaufman? I said, sure. I watch him every week on Taxi. He said, well, he's going to call you tomorrow. I said, what? He said, yeah, Andy Kaufman's going to call you tomorrow. He's got an idea he wants to run past you. And I didn't believe Bill. And then sure, my phone rings tomorrow, and it was Andy Kaufman calling, Mr. Lawler, this is Andy Kaufman. And so that's how it all came about.
Wow.
And really, he did just come down to wrestle women. And he was so excited, and he loved it the first time he did it. And then we brought him back a second time, and he loved that. And he was pretty much content just doing wrestling the women. And I sort of selfishly thought, man, how can I get the rub off of this big Hollywood star and get something out of this deal for myself, right? So I went to Andy and I said, man, you've gone about as far as you can go with wrestling women. I said, you need to have a match with a man. And he said, oh, no, I couldn't do that. I've been hurt or whatever. I couldn't just do it. And I said, I promise you, Andy, you and I can have a match, and you'll not get hurt, and it'll be the greatest thing ever. And so he came over. I showed him how to do the pile driver. I showed him how he's going to do the suplex and all that sort of stuff. And and that's just how it all went. You know, it just
How was
but
your relationship with Andy? Did you guys become good friends during
oh
that?
yeah, absolutely, great friends, great friends. Yeah, he stayed at my house, and I shot all our interviews for him with my camera, and just nobody there but me and Andy in my front room. And I mean, that we shot the interview there of him showing the people a bar of soap.
Oh,
We shot the interview of him. I shot the interview of him showing the people a roll of toilet paper.
Yeah.
those were the greatest, some of the greatest interviews of all
Yeah.
time.
All
That
the
was
time.
some of the best things
Oh,
I've
yeah.
ever seen in
Yeah,
wrestling.
yeah, yeah.
It
Yeah,
was.
and
It
he
got
and I,
so much heat.
yeah, he and I put those interviews together right there in the front room of my house, and I filmed them. And then after we only showed two, after we had about four done in the can, and after we showed the one with the toilet paper, the station manager called me up on the phone and said, "Jerry, please." I said, "What?" He said, "Please, no more Andy Kaufman hygiene in videos." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yes, it is making everybody mad." And the switchboard operator, it's driving her crazy. That's all she gets all day long are complaints about Andy Kaufman's interviews.
Awesome.
So,
Hey, how did the Letterman interview come along? And was David aware of what you guys were going to do?
well, it came along just out of the blue. I mean, probably about 6 months. See, a lot of people don't realize that Andy and I continued to work. We had the big match with the pile drivers. He went to the hospital, stayed in the hospital for 3 days, and then he came back with his neck with his neck and well, he stayed in the hospital with his neck in traction for 3 days. Then he came back with the neck brace on, and we did all of. He kept coming back. He just loved it. I mean, he was so. He told me one time. He said, "I would quit everything that I'm doing in Hollywood. I'd quit taxi, everything, if I could just stay involved with wrestling." That's how much he loved it. And so he was still coming back. I mean, I bet we had 20 or 30 more different kind of matches. I mean, I had a boxing match with him. I had Jimmy Hart managing him, and then he turned on Jimmy Hart, and then I mean, then I had matches with him and Jimmy Hart, tag team matches, and then he turned on Jimmy Hart, and I agreed to be Andy's partner against Jimmy Hart and the Assassins, and then so as soon as that match started, I walked out into the ring with the Assassins, and Andy came up from behind. He'd already put powder out in his hand and tapped me on the shoulder. Boom, threw the powder in my eyes, and those guys picked me up and pile drive me. And I mean, he put out a bounty to anybody that could put me in the hospital. He'd pay him $10,000. We were just going back and forth with all this and drawing terrific money in Memphis. I was tickled to death. Jerry Jarrett was tickled to death. And then all of a sudden, one day out of the blue, I get a call from Andy out in Hollywood, and he said, "Hey, you want to be on the David Letterman show?" And I went, "No, let me think about it, Andy." "Yes." "What do you mean?" "Sure, I would." So he said, "Well, we can be on there next week if you want to, come up to New York and everything." So, I mean, that's it. We were just going to be on the David Letterman show, and so I was just so excited. Never, that may have been the first time I'd ever been to New York, and so we get up there and we have a meeting with the segment producer. They tape the show at 5:30 every afternoon, and you have a meeting in the morning at like 10:30 with the segment producer. His name was Robert Morton. And so I got there at 10:30, and I went into his office, and he's sitting there by himself. And he said, "Well, Jerry," he said, "I'm sorry, but Andy refused to be in the same room with you. He told me that, I had him in here earlier, and I told him that you were coming. He just left. So I told him what we're going to do, and now I'll tell you." And he said he just couldn't be in the same room with you. So I said, "Okay." So the guy said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have you guys on for 2 segments. The first segment, Dave is going to show the film of you pile driving Andy, and he's going to show the footage of Andy making fun of women and making fun of Memphis and all this sort of stuff." And he said, "I'd like you guys to be a little bit antagonistic, not too much, but a little bit. And then Dave's going to take a break. And then in the second segment, Andy will apologize to you for making fun of wrestling, and you apologize to Andy for hurting his neck. And then Andy's going to get up and sing what the world needs now is love, sweet love.
Huh.
So that was it. And so I said, okay, that'll be funny. So I go back to my hotel room, and Andy comes over to my room. We're staying at the same hotel. Andy comes in and says, well, what do you think of what they want us to do? And I said, oh man, I said, that'll be funny and everything. But I said, you got to realize if you and I go on TV, network TV, and kiss and make up and apologize to each other, that's going to be the end of us doing anything down in Memphis. And he said, I'll never forget. He said, man, you're right. And he just hesitated. And then he looked at me. He said, wonder what would happen if you just hauled off and slugged me. And I said, at the time, I said, oh, Andy, I said, we can't do that. I said, first of all, they're taping the show at 5:30. They'll never show it. I said, second of all, I'll get arrested. And I got to be back in Memphis tomorrow. You know, we just can't do that. And he said, yeah, you're right. It wouldn't. For somebody going to be a telemarketer or whatever. But anyway, I said, so we just went there later on thinking that we're going to do what Robert Morton said. And so we got out there for the first segment, and you know, he showed the film of me pile driving him, and we got a little bit antagonistic. That's where I told him, I said, you know, his mother wanted a girl and his father wanted a boy, and they were both satisfied. And so just, you know, some different insults. And then I found out, I didn't know at the time, but I found out later during that show why he wanted us to be a little antagonistic, because I think it got down to the point where Andy said, well, I could have sued you, but I'm not that kind of guy. And I looked at him and said, what kind of guy are you? And at that point, Dave, I looked over at Dave, and he's looking down under his desk for something with his foot. And all of a sudden they had a ring bell underneath this table. And he starts kicking it with his foot, right? And it goes ding, 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 ding. And he said, well, we're gonna take a break here and kind of get things. We may have to get the hoses out and everything, but we'll be back with Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman right after this. So we go to the break, and Andy jumps up and walks away. He would not even sit there beside me while we're at break. And I'll never forget, during the break, Dave Letterman leans over and says, did you know that I got started out in wrestling? I used to be the ring announcer for Dick the Bruiser up in Indianapolis. I said, no. Yeah. He said, no, I never knew that. He said, yeah, sure did. He said, yeah, I was at all the Bruiser shows up there. So anyway, they're like 10, 9, 8. He comes. Are you still there?
Yep, we're still
Yeah.
here.
We ain't going anywhere.
Okay. So anyway, he comes back over and sits down, and so we started talking again, insulting each other and everything, and it just went on and on and on. And he never apologized to me, and I never apologized to him, and we just kept arguing back and forth. And I'm waiting any minute for him to apologize. And then finally, I guess we'd just been out there so long that Dave realized, well, you know, this ain't going as planned. This has kind of gone off the track, so I'm going to have to take a break. It was time to take a break and get that segment over with, right? So he said, well, guys, you know, we'll get this straightened out, but right now we're gonna have to take a break. And so Paul Schaefer started playing the music, and I swear to God, Dave didn't know, Andy didn't know, and I didn't know. When I heard that music, I realized this is it. We're off. This is our second segment, and we're done. And I just stood up, looked Andy right in the eyes to try to give him a little hint of what was coming. And I just hauled off and slapped the snot out of him, knocked him right out of his chair, and I mean, I slapped him as hard as I could, knocked him out of his chair.
So Andy didn't know and Dave didn't know nothing. You just decided I'm calling an ad lib here.
I'm going into business.
At the very last second, spur of the moment, and that's how it went down.
You
And
fist
then,
felt it.
and then Andy went crazy after that, right? He went off and
Yes,
grabbed
I
it.
went back to, they took me, the security took me back to the green room. And, you know, it's only a 2-minute break when you're watching it on TV for commercials. But actually, they shut down taping for about 15 minutes. And I don't know if they were talking about what to do, what in the world, should we show that? Should we arrest this guy? What should we do, right? And I'm sitting in the green room by myself. And 15 minutes goes by. At first, I would hear women screaming and stuff out there and everything. And I go, Jesus Christ, they're going a little overboard with this, right? So finally, everything quieted down, and the door kind of peeked open, and there was this little guy, and he said, it was like an intern, and he said, Mr. Lawler, Dave wants to know if you'll come back out and sort of wrap things up on this segment. I said, I'll be glad to. And so then, right then, I knew they're going to show that. Or, well, then I thought also, I said, well, they may want us to try to redo that second segment. But then when I got out there and sat down, Andy was over on the side where that far door over there, that you've seen the show where they come and go out of, and he's holding the side of his head. And they started the countdown, 5, 4, and Dave says, Andy, are you going to come back out here? And he says, no, if I do, I'll say words you can't say on television. So boom, we're back on the air, and Dave said, well, we're back, and Jerry Lawler's here, and Andy's here, sort of, and some nights I wish Tom Snyder was still here, which he used to have the show before Dave. And he said, but that's not the case now. And all of a sudden, here comes Andy in over Dave's shoulder, and he starts pounding the desk, and he let loose with the most unbelievable tirade of cussing. I mean, MF, CS, I mean, everything you could think of. He is cussing me out like a dog. And I'm looking at him like, what the, Andy, come on, what are you doing? I mean, they're obviously going to show the slap, and there's no way they can show this, right? And so I leaned back in my chair to try to show him with my body language that what you're doing is not cool, right? And I crossed my legs. And then he just got mad, and he grabbed Dave's coffee and but he did like I did with a slap. He grabbed Dave's coffee and he looked me in the eyes, just like, and then gave me time to move out of the way. And then I jumped up at him again, and he took off. The security came and got me, and Dave just wrapped up that segment. And with the greatest line ever, Dave said, and he was clearing the coffee away in his papers, and he said, well, I think you could say some of those words on television. I said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. What you cannot do is throw coffee. So anyway, that was the end of that segment. And then the security guard got me out onto the elevator, took me downstairs, took me right back to my hotel room. I didn't see Andy or anybody, or didn't hear from anybody until 11:30 that night when the show came on. I turned the TV on, and they showed every bit of it, everything. The only thing, when the cussing came on, you could read Andy's lips so well, but they put in, instead of beeping it out, they made it even better. They put in the sound of like a cuckoo clock. So Andy was going, and then he'd go cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. And it was unbelievable. I mean, as soon as that was over, New York Post, New York Times, news people, everybody started calling immediately. And the coolest thing to me ever was the next morning, Bill Apter picked me up from the hotel, and he was going to drive me around. He took pictures of me at the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building, and we're driving me around to do a photo shoot for the magazine that was coming out next month. And as we're driving in the taxi cab down, I don't know what street it was in Manhattan, but I looked over and I saw Rodney Dangerfield's restaurant. And of course, like I said, it was about 10:30 in the morning or whatever. I said, oh my gosh, Dangerfield's, I would love to go there. And it said, appearing tonight, Red Fox. And Bill said, hey, pull over. So he told the guy to pull over, and he said, I'm going to run in and see. He said, sometimes, even though Red Fox is here, sometimes Rodney Dangerfield will be here as well, and he'll just like come out and introduce the acts, you know. So he goes inside to see if Rodney's going to be there that night. And all of a sudden he comes out and he's like, "Oh my gosh, come on, you're not gonna believe this." I said, "What?" He said, "Rodney's in there right now and he wants to see you so bad."
Wow.
I jump out, I go in, here's Rodney Dangerfield in a bathrobe, and a hot looking girl beside him, 10:30 in the morning. He's in a bathrobe sitting at his bar. And I come walking in and he
Wait
said,
a minute. He's in a bathrobe at his bar?
"Yes, yes."
I'm not going to say anything,
With
but
a,
man,
with a,
what a
with a
lie.
hot looking, with a hot looking chick sitting right beside him. And so, I mean, it was like he was on stage. He goes, "Oh my God, that was the greatest thing I ever seen last night. Oh my God, that was the greatest thing I've ever seen on television." And apparently Andy's manager, George Shapiro, is also Rodney Dangerfield's manager. So he was watching that, and he was good friends with Andy. He had Andy in this club before, but yeah, he was just all over that. He said that was the greatest thing he had ever seen on television ever.
So when they took you out after the segment was over, you didn't meet with Letterman or any of the people? They just
Oh
took you
no!
to the elevator?
Matter of fact, I'll never forget, the security guard got me into the elevator and pushed the button down, and he said, "I want to get you out of this building because Kaufman will have you arrested." He said, "His elevator," I swear the guy said, "his elevator don't go all the way to the top floor. So let me get you out of here." And so he got
Wow.
me down and took me back to my hotel.
I saw Jerry where one time Letterman later told you when you met him later that was the one time that he felt like he lost complete control of the show. And here's a guy who had been involved in a way as an announcer with wrestling and everything. But
yeah, and he also told me too. He said for years we referred to that as the famous show, and I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Because he said that show made us famous." He said that show, that episode made us famous. He said, "I'd already had 2 other shows on network TV that had gotten canceled." And he said, "If I'd gotten canceled from this," he said, my career would have been shot. And he said, "That show put us on the map."
wow.
So, yeah.
So he basically gave you credit for saving his career, David Letterman.
That's sort of what it
Awesome.
sounded like.
Did you talk to Letterman after it? I know you filmed the show about Andy, the movie with Jim Carrey, but did you talk to Letterman during that time, during that time to get his take on it?
No, never did get to talk to him. The next time I talked to him was the doing the film with Jim Carrey, and that's when he told me that they referred to it as the famous show and all of that stuff.